I'm Alan Girding, and this is TKtv, and today we're going to talk about Mothership. Specifically, we have a box set out for Mothership, the sci-fi horror role-playing game by Sean McCoy. And a lot of people ask, what is the difference between the original Mothership that I got way back in the day, and what's going to be in this box set through Kickstarter? And I thought there's no better person to ask than the designer himself, my business partner, the Sean to my McCoy, Sean McCoy. There he... Oh, hey! At the time of this recording, we haven't launched our Kickstarter yet. How you feeling about the upcoming Kickstarter for the Mothership box set?
So we launch in 2 weeks. I'm busy. I'm working with a manufacturer to nail down the final costs, make sure we have all the stretch goals covered, fine-tuning the rules, because we're hoping about a week after the Kickstarter to release the updated player's guide, just so that while you're waiting for everything else to fulfill, you'll have a PDF in your hands of the new rules. You can start playing immediately, start seeing all the changes and how they feel, and give us feedback before we go to print. But yeah, it's a lot. It's one of the bigger Kickstarters we've run just in terms of preparation for it. A lot going on.
There's so much we could talk about behind the scenes, so much leading up to this, and we'll probably have to save it for other episodes, because if I know us, we can talk till the cows come home all about pretty much anything.
Oh yeah.
You name a topic and you and me, or... But let's get to the point. I am a consumer. I am a fan of Mothership OG. I got it way back in the day. I've gotten all the official releases. I have Gradient Descent, which was the most recent. I have Pound of Flesh. And of course, I also have Dead Planet. So I am really excited about the box set, but at the same time, I'm a little worried because, wait a second, are things gonna be different to the point where what I have is no longer functional? Are you gonna change things that I love about it and make it crappier? Is this gonna be the traditional 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons to 4th edition, which just totally instigated mass hysteria and mutiny, which gave birth to Pathfinder? That's a whole nother conversation. So Sean, walk me through this. What are some of the main things? Calm me down, get me excited, hold my hand through the differences between the box set and my original Mothership.
It's pretty exciting. I think we were in a good situation where basically Mothership got popular much faster than we anticipated, to the point where some of these things we've been wanting to change since day one. And a lot of the changes we've implemented in this first edition box set are house rules that are very common on our Discord, specifically with things like combat and violence. The biggest thing, Tuesday night games, our thing is like open table gameplay, just making things very easy for casual gamers to get into. We don't like things that are very difficult to teach or explain. We want to just start playing immediately. So any changes we made in the new first edition's box set were in the service of making things easier to explain. There's a couple things we did. We rewrote things to be easier to explain. We cleaned up the rules to remove edge cases, and we streamlined the rules to be more cohesive. Those are the three major shifts that we did.
So it sounds like you've taken what people have really liked about Mothership and just enhanced it. Not made it more complicated, but actually made it even simpler and clearer.
Yeah, this is one of the few times where a new edition, instead of adding a bunch of rules, took out a ton of rules. We've removed more than we've added. We've added more content and we've explained things better, but we haven't added a lot more new rules like, oh, what are rules for cover? Or, oh, there's rules for jetpacks now. It's not that kind of edition change. It's about making the game quicker and easier and more fun to play without changing a lot of the math under the hood.
What you've said too is that this comes from a large Mothership community of basically play testing. For instance, just frequently asked questions. What does this mean? I'm confused about this, etc. And so it's editing. If we're being really honest, when we published this baby, there was very little playtesting behind it. It was just kind of a hope and a dream that it would work. And now it has this huge following because it really does work really well. And because of that, you and I were talking behind the scenes. You don't want to call this first edition versus second edition. Instead, what are you referring to these differences between the original and the box set edition-wise?
So the box set to us, and the way we're going to be responding to it forever, is first edition. Everything before now we're calling 0E. The longest running joke, although you could see it in the books, is that this was an alpha and a beta, very extended one. Things just took off a lot faster than we anticipated. But the box set is the first edition to me because it's the first version of the game that has everything as we originally envisioned. It's got a monster book. It's got a Warden's Guide. It's in a box.
It's what you're traditionally more used to looking at when you get a role-playing game. Ooh!
Yeah.
Show
this
it.
is the original Dungeons and Dragons, right? And it came in a box, and it has little, basically, zines in it, right? Like, this is what they look like. That was what I wanted this game to be like. And we just got some prototype copies in that we had produced so we could take photos and look at how everything fits. And this is what it is. It's, you know.
Oh man, that looks sexy. It looks just like the original.
Box. It's hefty. You can even see it says prototype copy on the back. It looks just like the original. It's the same dimensions, and then it's filled with our zine rulebooks. So that's why I call this first edition. It's what I had originally envisioned and what we had talked about the complete version of the game being. Everything to this was sort of testing things out. Yes, we did release a bunch of modules and treat it like we would treat anything else, but all that's been in service of getting to this box set. I think the big thing too is we believe in adventures and modules. That's where the game is. The system is not as important to me. So as soon as the game came out, we'd hand this copy to people at Origins when it was released, and they'd say, well, is this it, or is there any adventures for it? We could go, oh shit, we need to get something put together immediately.
It's the #1 request.
Right. Can we get adventures for it?
So that was Origins. So by Gen Con, we had
boom,
Dead Planet.
Dead Planet.
Boom.
If this had not been a hit, I probably would have gone back to the basement, worked on the Warden's Guide, worked on the monster book, and said, okay, Alan, I've got a little bit more stuff, like maybe we should try releasing it again. But it took off, and so we've just been sort of chasing our tail ever since. So that's why this is first edition to me.
This makes perfect sense for me as a video game player because games on Steam and other platforms have the alpha early access version. And so one way to think of it, if you're a video gamer, is that was the early access. And finally, after we got in, tightened up the bolts, and everything else was 0 edition, now we're at first edition. We did release those adventure modules though. Am I just kind of boned in the bum then? Is there gonna be some incompatibilities with Dead Planet and Gradient Descent, which I just got recently? What's that mean for those people that already own modules and even third-party support? There's so many third-party modules out there from the 0 edition. What does that mean?
It doesn't mean much in terms of compatibility. A lot of the content in those modules is just adventure content that translates very well one way or the other. There's 2 specific rules that are changing that we'll release conversion kits for, but the big 2 are we're getting rid of the armor save. The armor save featured in combat and was very complicated with these opposed rolls. We've gotten rid of the opposed rolls. Instead of the armor save, you now have armor points, usually like 1 to 10.
Okay.
And basically, armor will ignore any damage under your armor points, but as soon as you take more damage than you have armor, your armor is destroyed. So if you have 3 armor
and I take 2 damage, I don't take anything.
You don't take any.
You know what we can do, Sean, is we can do a play example of what the old armor system was compared to our new armor system. So in the old system, I'm fighting some type of hideous life form that came out of the airlock, and I failed to eject it into space because it was too strong. It pulled itself in. Comes in, I'm like, ah, crap, I'm running in. Whips me, ah! And I get hit. Now, let's suppose it rolls damage. What should I do from this point in 0 edition? The original.
In 0 edition, rules as written, you make an opposed check where you make an armor save while they make a combat check, right? So let's say my combat 60. You failed your armor save, and here's one of the weird, annoying parts of 0 edition rules as written and why so many people house rule. You failed, and I failed to hit you. So we both failed, so nothing happened. So you wasted roll. Let's say you failed, and I hit. Okay, I do damage, I roll my damage. Let's say you succeeded, and I hit. You don't take any damage, or you take half damage, depending on your sort of house rule. You see all those like weird contrasts?
Yeah, it has that flow chart. Success versus success, success versus failure, failure versus failure, failure versus success.
And then you get into criticals. I succeeded and you critically succeeded. I succeeded and you critically failed. It's just too much rolling, too much compare and contrast. Now, you make a combat check. If you hit, you roll damage. If you do damage up to their armor points, let's say you have 3 armor and I do 3 damage, totally ignored. If you do 4 damage though, the armor's destroyed.
Okay, so as long as my armor isn't exceeded in damage, then I keep my armor. So if I have an armor of 3 and you do 3 damage, haha, nothing. Wow!
Right.
That tail whip, bounced right off me. If you do 4 damage, I only take 1 hit, but that armor now is splayed open. No! And it's useless to me now.
Exactly. And this is interesting because we even give armor points to clothes. Normal clothes are like 1. So it creates
Sexy.
this sort of situation, oh yeah, where armor's being destroyed and you need to scavenge more. So it creates a scene where you put on a leather jacket that you found from the dead captain, or you open up some lockers in a derelict ship and you see that they have new vac suits and your vac suit's all patched up. You want to change into that because you want the armor. Cover works the same way. So you have like light and heavy cover that also give you armor points. So now you're like jumping under tables to sort of ignore the giant beast, you know, scratching at you, that kind of stuff. But that's an easy conversion to make.
Okay, so there's one big difference. Armor. And that may require some conversion in these niche specific situations. But what else is different?
One of the big questions we always get asked were, what is this hits thing I keep seeing? Because it's not explained very much in the original rulebook. So monsters would say hits 1 in parentheses 5, or hits 2 in parentheses 10, something like that, right? And it basically means the enemy has 1 or 2 pools of health, each worth 10 hit points. So think of them as like life bars in a video game where you take 10 damage, you lose a life, and then you take 10 more and you lose your second life. In the new version, that works for monsters and players. So now players will start with 2 hits, and I think it's 1d10 plus 10 health. And if you lose a hit, which we now call wounds, you roll on the injuries table and you get some awful injury. So that alone doesn't matter that much because that's not going to be referenced anywhere in the modules. And additionally, the old monsters were already using that system. So again, that doesn't affect the monsters.
If I can simplify this, it sounds like if we were to compare this to video games, you have so many lives and that's your wounds. But every life is slightly weaker than the previous one because you're taking an injury. So if I have 3 lives and each life has like 12 hit points, and boom, I take that 12 hit point. Oh, now I've lost that life. Now I have 2 lives left, but now I have some type of permanent limp that I'm dealing with. Is that a fair explanation?
Absolutely. That's totally fair. We have a nice, cool critical wounds table, and that has even the chance when you lose a wound that you just die. There's a very small chance, but it means that you're never really sure. Am I going to get my full 3 wounds or am I going to die after the first one? Combat's a lot deadlier because previously you had 2 times your strength in health, which for most people was in the 60s or 70s. And so people were taking tons and tons of blasts of pulse rifle damage before they were even getting close to being worried about their health. And it didn't create that scary, tense feeling.
Right.
So now, because your health is 1d10 plus 10, you're talking 11 to 20 health, 2 wounds, maybe 3 if you're a Marine. So you're a lot weaker. And to deal with that, we also rebalance the weapon damage. So now weapons are doing 1d10, 2d10, 3d10 damage, or just a straight up a wound, as opposed to 5d10, 3d10. Way less damage that you have to roll.
So boiling this down into simplicity, you can die in 1 hit, although that's not an everyday
Likely.
thing. Realistically, even if you come back and you patch yourself up, you've got a scarred, mangled looking type of space adventurer. Probably doesn't want to go back into any deep, dark moon base anytime soon.
Yes, we've included a lot more longer lasting injuries and conditions. The panic table's been reworked to have more conditions that you have to deal with. Same goes for the critical wounds. So it's about these lasting injuries, and you can get healed and you can get cyber mods and you can deal with your psychological conditions and all that sort of stuff. But that's stuff you need to take care of in game. So it doesn't just create a panic situation where it's like, my arm got blown off and I'm going to die in 2 rounds. It's a situation where you have to deal with it. Let's patch it up. Let's go get a cyber arm for me now.
Gotcha.
The way this will affect old modules, though, is all the damage in the new edition is lower because we gave you way less health. So the damage has been rebalanced. That means your old modules still work, but they're much deadlier because all the monsters are doing damage under the old rules. So what might be 5d10 in the old book might only be 2d10 in the new book. There will be a very simple conversion chart that we can give you for that, but it's nothing that difficult. And if you mess up, congratulations, your old modules are just harder, which I'm okay with also.
Yeah, because that's the sense of horror anyways. I know in my own Mothership play sessions, I typically remind my players, don't get too attached to your characters.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like that tension. I like when violence becomes a thing. We've even renamed it. I don't call it combat rules anymore. I call it violent encounters because it's all about not being another mini game and not programming players to think of it like a video game where violence is just an obstacle that you have to overcome and it's assumed you will. If it wasn't assumed you'd overcome violence in Metroid or anything like that, you wouldn't be able to have a game. Those violent counters are built to be overcome. In Mothership, they're not built to be overcome in that way. They're built to be run from and be thought of very, very craftily and avoided at all costs, because every single one could be your player's last.
You also mentioned panic. Are there any differences there?
So the panic rules are basically the same. If you critically fail or run into certain situations like seeing a bunch of people die, you're going to make a panic check. The big changes that people might not like is we've introduced a new die. So everything is D100, but in the old system, you used to roll 2D10 under your stress. And this got confusing for players because previously rolling under was good, but now rolling under your stress was bad. Why are we rolling 2D10 instead of D100? It just created this barrier for new players. So we've introduced a D20, which we call the panic die. You only use it in one situation in the game, and that's when you're making panic checks. So hopefully picking up this new component will help trigger players to know, okay, now that I'm rolling this D20, now if I roll low, that's bad. So it's the same rule. You roll D20 under your stress, so you very quickly can tell what's going on, and it's very easy to explain to new players, hey, you don't ever want to touch that die. If you're touching that die, something bad's happened. The other thing is that the panic table in previous games, you would add your stress to your panic roll, and that meant by the time you had 5 or 6 or 7 stress, people were having heart attacks, dropping dead left and right. It was very deadly and also kind of silly for a lot of people. And it also meant you almost never saw the panic effects on the lower end of the table, because once you had 1 stress, which it was very likely you'd never roll under a 1 on 2d10, right? You'd have to roll at least a 3 to see any effects. You'd never see those ones at the bottom. So now you roll a d20, and whatever that roll is your roll in the panic table. The new panic table is just results 1 through 20. So if you have 10 stress and you roll a 9, you panic, and we look up number 9, which is deflated. You gain a new condition. Whenever a nearby crew member fails a save, gain 1 stress. So now we have these permanent conditions that make it so that you have this extra thing that you have to deal with until you get it taken care of. The maximum stress you can have is 20, and any stress you take over 20 instead permanently reduces a stat or a save. So let's say you normally gain 1 stress whenever you fail a stat check or a save, right?
Right.
So let's say I have 20 stress and I say make a strength check. And you go,
I failed!
I failed. You don't have 21 stress. You now lower your strength by 1. You're now just breaking and crumbling and becoming more frail, whether that's sanity or body or fear or strength.
It's
or
totally
speed.
situation based. Like what is stressing you
Right.
out is totally going to affect. Is that affecting your strength, your speed?
So now it's very, very bad to have 20 stress. And we still have the heart attack on there, but it's not as game ending. We call it a heart attack or a short circuit for androids, and you permanently lose a wound. So if you have 2 wounds, now the maximum you have is 1 wound.
Wow.
And you have disadvantages on all rolls for 1d10 hours, and you permanently raise your minimum stress by 1. So you've just become a lot more frail. You're more easy to panic, you're weak for a little bit, and you just don't have the same capacity. Now, all this stuff should be solved in game if you want it to be solved, but that was the point, was to create long-term ongoing situations. We've also tried our best. Alan and I have talked, we've talked with some sensitivity readers to make the panic language less clinical, to make it less about you now have PTSD or some actual condition. Now they're described as like frightened, deflated, you feel haunted, or you have prophetic visions or rage, as opposed to some of the old terminology a little too close to home.
It was much easier for us to make that change than it was for us to ask people, hey, don't be bothered by these clinical terms and worry if we're being insensitive to the actual clinical population of individuals that have to deal with these very real psychological disorders that are very commonplace. Happy to make that change. So let's take a step back just to recap on this a little bit, because I love the panic die system. I don't want to totally take a shit all over the original system because I loved it. It was great. But I remember
It was one of your first complaints.
Like literally we first played it and I said, hey man, it's really bizarre that we're using a D100 system, but then time out. Now we're using the 2d10s not as a d100 but as 2d10, then we add them up, but then we have to add our stress and then subtract this. It was very cumbersome for me. So the idea that is now just as simple as rolling a d20, and it has that amazing effect of this is the singular panic die. So when you pick it up, you can feel the weight of doom potentially upon you. I don't want it. Picking up the die itself induces panic alone. and then converting it into the panic table is much simpler. In the new system, you roll the panic die and you want to roll above your stress. So
That's right,
it
yeah.
gets harder and harder and harder. So if I have a stress 1, the chances are great on a 20-sided die, I'm going to roll over 1.
Right.
But once I have 10 stress, now it's like a 50-50 chance that I may actually panic on that panic roll.
Yes.
So the worst possible situation would be you have 20 stress and you roll a 20. You shouldn't be rolling 20s and failing a panic check.
If you have 20 stress and you roll a 20, you collapse. You no longer control this character, hand your sheet to the warden, and roll up a new character. I've shown you this spread before, but in person it turns out really great. This is the range spread by David Hoskins, and basically you have the rules for the new range bands. The old book had like 20 meters, 30 meters. We've just converted that to close, nearby, far away, and out of range. But the illustration actually illustrates what's going on in the diagram. I love it.
It's so gorgeous and it's so practical because it gives you that visual reference of what the difference is.
A lot of the changes are quality of life changes where they're new, better explanations, clear language, and better diagrams. Things like that illustration. There's more example text and some of it's funnier, but we've really tried to make it a lot easier for new people to get in and play. We've even gone back to the classic. Probably the thing we got famous for first was our character sheet, and redesigned the character sheet again to keep that flowchart, but make it simpler, faster, less cluttered, because this is a weird thing that I think you and I haven't talked about that much. There will probably be more people playing this first edition box set than the total amount of people who've ever played Zero Edition. While you want to keep things real and true to the old fan base, of course, you also have to remember, like, we need to make the game better for all the new people who are going to play after this. We talked about this with Two Rooms and a Boom too. When we make changes, we can't just consider the past people who have played it, but all the potential future people who could play it, and making the game better for them.
I fully believe most people will be incredibly happy with first edition, and there will be the exception where someone says, I like Zero Edition better than first edition, because of the reasons that you already spoke. This is actually just really fixing some shortcomings and not overhauling the same system. At the core, it's the same. And I use the example in our conversations of the difference between Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Second Edition. Because Second Edition is so similar to First Edition, they've literally just fixed a lot of the issues that brought it down. I don't think Mothership Zero Edition was as broken as First Edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but I think the spiritual comparison works in that it's very rare that someone says, I prefer First Edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay than Second Edition Woofer. It's like, they're pretty much the same thing, just Second Edition is cleaner.
No, I know what you mean. There's definitely aesthetic things to like about Zero E. It's just that it's very raw, and you could tell that it's a labor of love. I did all the art for it. If you're a big hipster like me when it comes to role-playing games, there is some sort of aesthetic value to having this like singular vision behind a game, but it's so much easier and better worded. There's these weird edge cases, like in Zero E, we say something like, oh, you need to make a speed check at the top of every round to establish initiative. And if you have the tactics skill, you get to confer advantage to some friends or whatever. I don't even remember it. It's such an edge case. But it's one of like only 2 skills that gets a call out in the rulebook about how it affects a certain situation. We've removed all those examples. And in the Warden's Guide, we just say, hey, if your players have skills that help in certain areas, work with them to give them a bonus or whatever. It's not that every skill has a bunch of different edge cases that you need to memorize. It's that you and the players and the warden need to be in open dialogue about some of the stuff. So you could say, oh, you know, I have tactics and I was wondering if I could sort of plan this ambush to hit the enemies better. And the warden can then, on a case-by-case basis, make a ruling. I think it's much better to teach wardens, GMs, referees to be better than it is to just give a ton of rules that assume they're not going to be any good and just make them memorize this stuff. And if you memorize all these rules, then the game will be better. I think it's a much more important goal to teach your wardens how to be better at their job and how to make good rulings in the moment, rather than just saying, just memorize all the shit we came up with.
It's exactly why I hate Pathfinder. And don't let my opinion sway you from enjoying what you enjoy. If you're a Pathfinder fan, more power to you. But for me, the fact that there's a rule for every little thing you can do in Pathfinder drives me nuts. I'm much more of a theater of the mind person. I'm much more of a narrative-based person. As soon as the dice become the focus of play, I can't stand it. I want there to be this storytelling flow so we can get on with the adventure. If the rules are really doing anything except helping the warden do that, I think they're getting in the way.
Yeah, I 100% agree. There's a lot of you must unlearn what you have learned when it comes to GM advice. One of the things I say to our writers a lot is that encounter design beats system design. So I think as game designers, our first instinct, my first instinct, is to often design a new system. So you say like, ooh, we want to do asteroid mining. Well, okay, there's 3 types of asteroids and they each have this percent chance. And you have to make this kind of check. And if that works, and you create this kind of cool mini game because that scratches your game designer itch. And those are often my first drafts of new components of the game, is to design this subsystem, get it tweaked right, and then go, why would anyone want to memorize this? This is stupid. And remember that encounter design is what's important. What are interesting asteroid mining encounters? I think you can run a really tactically combat heavy Mothership game that don't have a lot of rules. What you need is an understanding of complex tactical encounters, of ambushes and high ground and all that sort of stuff. And you don't necessarily need a lot of rules for people on the high ground have this, people on this have that. You need to understand what makes those encounters interesting from a realistic perspective. And then you'll have like a fun time running those encounters. I think a lot of times we want to offload those rules because they simulate the same experience without having to do any of the work of designing interesting encounters.
Yeah.
But for my part, I would much rather release a book of 100 interesting violent encounters that you can run. And I actually wrote a D10 list on my blog of like, here's interesting ways combat can go, rather than just create a system to take that sort of encounter's place.
It's a tough balance, and it's something we could talk forever about. You want to give the DMs, the wardens, all the tools they can to take a lot of work off of their plate so they can just get into the game and rely on the system and play. But at the same time, you want that freedom of expression, and you don't want them having to dive back into the rulebook. For instance, one of the things that I do in almost any role-playing game I'm playing is if I have to look something up in the rulebook, I just say, F it. And instead, I just tell my players, everyone roll a die. You want to roll low, or you want to roll high, depending on the system that we're playing. And then everyone just tells me the number they rolled. And then, like reading tea leaves, I can tell you what happens, whether it be mining asteroids, whether it be finding some type of box in the middle of the woods, whether it be falling down a cliff. It doesn't matter when I say roll low and they're saying, uh-oh, I rolled a 99. Right away, all the players are like, you idiot! And there's already that emotional tension that you get without all the complicated, what does this mean, what is that, who needs to roll it, and do I have to move a decimal point, etc. Reading tea leaves, letting the players have the drama of the die roll, I think is really an important thing everyone needs to be able to do. Any other changes that we should know about?
No, like I said, it's mostly those 3 things and then some rewording. The whole book's been rewritten top to bottom, but the system is very reliable. It's just a straight D100 system. Most of our work has gone into making it an easier, better game to run and play at the table, not into tweaking a lot of systems. The stuff we fixed was stuff we were going to fix from the beginning. It's our first FAQ in the Discord is like, what does this hit system mean? Or like, combat seems kind of like clunky. Is anybody going to do anything about that? We've had house rules from day one, and now we're finally getting to implement them. But if you want to be a part of that process, back the Kickstarter. And just from a transparency perspective, it's just a pledge. Obviously, your money isn't taken until the campaign ends. Really sets the tone, the momentum, and behind the scenes sets a lot of stuff off with our advertising and our marketing and all that sort of stuff, to where now if we're funded, a lot more kicks in behind the scenes. So whether you know it or not, those pledges mean a ton to your creators. But go in, back us November 2nd at the course that are hiring, and then after the Kickstarter ends, you'll get that free PDF of the core rules, and you can be a part of that conversation and tell us, you know, what you like or how the math or combat is working out at your table. It's the only chance we're going to get to playtest on this large a scale before a print run ever, and it's going to be hugely important.
Beautifully said. So if you're a fan, please back us. I'm excited. Every time I talk to you, I just want to play more Mothership.
Me
More
too.
importantly, I want to play more Mothership like with you too.
Ooh.
It's kind of interesting playing Mothership with the creator, and I haven't gotten to do that with you yet. I haven't run you through any of the adventures that I've made for Mothership.
I'd love that.
Yeah, that would be cool. I'm looking forward to seeing the changes. Thank you so much for viewing. Don't forget to share the shit out of this episode, do all that stuff. I don't care. We just do this for fun anyways. I love you, Sean.
Love you too, man.
This episode is
Finished. I wish more guests were comfortable with that.
I just dropped something that's glass and it shattered.
Did you really?
Yeah.